The echoes of wealth and power surrounded Nicholas Grayson, like an unshakable fortress. As a self-made millionaire, he had built an empire that stretched across industries, a name synonymous with success. But beneath the polished image and tailored suits was a man who had once loved fiercely, and lost just as deeply. His past was buried under layers of distractions, board meetings, and transactions worth millions. He never allowed himself to look back, to dwell on the one woman who had slipped through his fingers all those years ago. Until today. Nicholas sat in his sleek penthouse office, the skyline of New York City stretched out before him like a kingdom under his rule. The low hum of a jazz playlist filled the space, but his mind was elsewhere. A single envelope lay unopened on his mahogany desk, delivered by a private investigator he had hired for an unrelated matter. He had expected routine financial reports and security updates, nothing that could shake him. But the investigator's words still lingered in his mind. "Mr. Grayson, I've uncovered something rather unexpected. You might want to read this carefully." His fingers tightened around the letter, the weight of its contents suddenly feeling unbearable. He exhaled, unfolded the crisp paper, and scanned the words that would turn his world upside down. Mara Sullivan, formerly Mara Grayson, has been living in Charleston, South Carolina for the past 10 years. She has a son, Lucas Sullivan, age 10. DNA analysis confirms a 99.9% paternal match. Nicholas's breath hitched. His grip on the paper tightened as his vision blurred momentarily. He reread the words, searching for an error, a miscalculation, anything that could invalidate what he was seeing. A son. His mind reeled back a decade to the last time he had seen Mara. Their divorce had been messy, driven by misunderstandings, stubbornness, and a betrayal he had once believed to be unforgivable. The woman he had loved beyond reason had walked away, leaving behind nothing but silence. And now he was finding out that she hadn't left alone. A bitter cocktail of emotions churned inside him. Rage, disbelief, guilt. Had she hidden this from him? Had she kept his child away intentionally? His jaw clenched as he pressed the intercom. "James, cancel all my meetings for the day." His assistant hesitated. "Sir, you have..." "Cancel them," he repeated, his voice laced with authority. "And book me the first flight to Charleston." Nicholas had always prided himself on control. Every decision, every move was calculated. But this was the one thing in his life that had spiraled out of his grasp. He had spent 10 years believing that Mara was just a closed chapter in his life. He never imagined that she had been raising his son without him, and now he was going to find out why. Charleston, South Carolina was a far cry from the cold, corporate jungle of New York City. The warm, coastal air carried the scent of salt water and blooming jasmine, a place untouched by the ruthless grind of Wall Street. Nicholas's car pulled up in front of a modest 2-story house with white shutters and a garden bursting with colorful flowers. It was the kind of home he never would have pictured Mara in, far removed from the penthouses and gala events they had once attended as a power couple. He stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel path. He wasn't sure what to expect when he knocked on the door. Would Mara slam it in his face? Would she deny everything? Refuse to let him in? The door creaked open, and there she stood. Mara. The years had done little to dim her beauty. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose braid, wisps of curls framing a face that was as familiar as it was haunting. She had the same piercing green eyes that had once looked at him with love, then later with heartbreak. But now they were unreadable. For a moment neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, old wounds reopening with just a single glance. Finally, she exhaled. Nicholas. His name on her lips sent a shockwave through his chest. It had been years since he had last heard her say it. He swallowed hard. "Hello, Mara." She crossed her arms, her posture guarded. "What are you doing here?" Nicholas didn't waste time. He pulled the folded letter from his pocket and handed it to her. "I know." Mara's eyes flickered to the document, and in that instant he saw something he hadn't expected. Fear. Her fingers trembled as she read, her expression shifting from shock to resignation. Slowly, she closed the letter and let out a heavy sigh. "I should have known you'd find out eventually," she murmured. His jaw tightened. "You should have told me." Mara met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in her emerald eyes. "And if I had, would it have changed anything?" Nicholas felt a sharp pang of guilt at her words. He knew what she was implying. At the time of their divorce, he had been consumed by anger, blinded by his belief that she had betrayed him. He had shut her out, convinced himself that she had no place in his life anymore. But he never thought she had been pregnant. "I had a right to know," he said, his voice softer this time. Mara exhaled, rubbing her temples as though trying to gather her thoughts. "I wasn't keeping him from you out of revenge, Nicholas. I did what I thought was best." His fists clenched. "Best? For who? For you? For him? Or just to keep me in the dark?" Mara's expression hardened. "Best for a child who deserved stability, a child who didn't need to be raised in the middle of a toxic divorce or used as a pawn in a war between parents who couldn't see past their own pain." Nicholas flinched at the truth in her words. She wasn't wrong. Back then, he had been so consumed by winning the divorce battle that he had never stopped to think about what losing had truly cost him. And now, he had a 10-year-old son who didn't even know he existed. Mara sighed, stepping onto the porch and closing the door behind her, as if shielding the house from his presence. "He doesn't know you, Nicholas." Her voice softened. "He doesn't even know about you." A sharp pain stabbed through his chest. His own son, a boy who had his blood, his DNA, his name, had grown up never knowing he existed. Nicholas ran a hand down his face, his frustration mounting. "Then it's time he does." Mara's expression darkened with hesitation. "It's not that simple." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You don't get to make this decision alone, Mara. He's my son, too." She hesitated, conflict flashing in her gaze. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "Give me time." Nicholas clenched his jaw but nodded. Time. That was the one thing he had already lost with his son, and he wasn't about to lose anymore. Nicholas sat in his hotel room, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like an anchor. He had always believed that money, power, and control could solve any problem. But now, standing on the edge of something he never thought he would have, a chance at fatherhood, he felt completely powerless. Mara had asked for time, but how much more did she expect him to lose? His mind replayed their conversation over and over again. "He doesn't know you, Nicholas. Give me time." She had kept his son from him for 10 years. What else did she expect from him now? To walk away quietly? To pretend he didn't exist? Not a chance. Nicholas ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. He had never been a patient man, but this wasn't just another business deal or a legal battle. This was his son, his flesh and blood. He needed to do something. Reaching for his phone, he scrolled through his contacts until he found the name of the private investigator he had hired. The call rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Mr. Grayson," the investigator greeted. "I take it you've read the report?" Nicholas's grip tightened around the phone. "Tell me about him," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Tell me about my son." There was a brief silence before the investigator responded. "Lucas Sullivan," he said, 10 years old, lives with Mara in Charleston. He attends a small private school. Good grades, well liked by teachers, plays soccer on the weekends. Seems like a normal, happy kid. Nicholas swallowed hard. A small part of him had feared that Lucas had suffered, that maybe Mara hadn't been able to provide for him. But from the sound of it, she had given him a stable, normal life, something Nicholas had never really had growing up. But that didn't mean he didn't deserve to be in his son's life now. "Does he know anything about me?" Nicholas asked. The investigator hesitated. "From what I gathered, no. No mention of you anywhere. Not in school records, not in casual conversations. Mara never told him about you." Nicholas clenched his jaw. She had erased him. His fingers dug into his palm as a mixture of emotions surged inside him. Anger, regret, sorrow. He had been so caught up in the pain of their divorce that he had never once thought Mara had moved on completely, creating an entirely new life that didn't even have his name in it. He had to see his son. Even if Lucas didn't know him yet, Nicholas needed to see him with his own eyes. "Send me the address of his school," Nicholas instructed. The investigator paused. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Grayson?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The next morning, Nicholas stood outside Charleston Academy, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in a boardroom negotiation. The school was a charming private institution, the kind with brick pathways, towering oak trees, and colorful playgrounds filled with children laughing. He had never stepped foot in a place like this, not as a child and certainly not as a father, and now he was here to see his son for the first time. His gaze scanned the crowd of students filtering out of the front doors, his heart lurching with every passing second. And then he saw him, a boy with dark brown hair and bright green eyes, Mara's eyes, bouncing down the steps with a soccer ball tucked under his arm. Nicholas felt his breath catch in his throat. Lucas, his son. He looked so much like him that it was almost painful. The same sharp jawline, the same confident stride. Nicholas had never believed in fate, but standing there, watching his son from a distance, he felt something shift inside him. Lucas stopped to tie his shoelaces, and as he did, Nicholas noticed something. A group of older boys approaching, their expressions unfriendly. Bullies. Nicholas's muscles tensed. One of the older boys reached out and knocked the soccer ball out of Lucas's hands, sending it rolling onto the pavement. Lucas stiffened but didn't back down. "Hey, give that back." The boys just laughed. "Make us." Nicholas's jaw clenched. He had seen this scene play out too many times before. Only in his own childhood, he had been the one getting knocked around. Before he could think, his legs were moving. Nicholas strode forward, his presence enough to make the older boys hesitate. His towering height and sharp, commanding gaze sent an unspoken warning. "Give him back his ball," Nicholas said, his voice low but firm. The boys exchanged nervous glances before one of them kicked the ball back toward Lucas. "We were just messing around," one of them muttered before they turned and walked away. Lucas bent down, picked up the ball, and looked up, straight at Nicholas. For the first time their eyes met. Nicholas's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. "Thanks," Lucas said, dusting off his soccer ball. "Who are you?" Nicholas swallowed hard, every carefully crafted word he had rehearsed in his mind suddenly vanishing. This was his son, and he had no idea who he was. But before he could respond, another voice interrupted. "Lucas!" Nicholas turned just in time to see Mara. She was rushing toward them, her expression a mixture of shock and panic. Her gaze locked onto Nicholas, and he could see the unmistakable fear in her eyes. Lucas frowned. "Mom? What's going on?" Mara grabbed Lucas's hand and pulled him behind her, shielding him from Nicholas as though protecting him from a threat. "Lucas, go wait in the car," she said quickly. Lucas hesitated, but now. Something in her tone made the boy obey. He shot Nicholas one last curious glance before jogging toward the parking lot. Once he was gone, Mara whirled around, fury blazing in her emerald eyes. "What the hell are you doing here, Nicholas?" Nicholas took a steady breath. "I needed to see him." Mara's lips pressed into a tight line. "You had no right. He's my son, Mara. He's not just your son, he's mine too, and I raised him without you." Nicholas's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Because you never gave me the chance." Mara exhaled sharply, her anger wavering for just a moment before she shook her head. "You don't just get to show up now after 10 years and decide you want to be a father." Nicholas stepped closer. "I may not have known about him before, but I know now, and I am not going to disappear again." Mara's eyes searched his as if trying to determine whether he was serious, and he was. Dead serious. Nicholas had spent 10 years believing he had lost everything. Now, he had something to fight for. And he wasn't leaving Charleston without his son. Nicholas stood in the school parking lot watching Mara storm toward her car. His heart pounded, his fists clenched at his sides as he fought the urge to run after Lucas. He had seen his son, spoken to him, and now he was supposed to just walk away? Not happening. Mara yanked open the driver's side door, but Nicholas was faster. He stepped in front of it, blocking her from getting inside. "Move!" she hissed, her green eyes flashing with warning. "I can't, Mara." His voice was firm but not unkind. "Not until we talk." Mara exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the door so tightly her knuckles turned white. "There's nothing to talk about, Nicholas." He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Are you kidding me? You kept my son from me for 10 years and you think there's nothing to talk about?" She flinched but quickly masked it with anger. "You were never supposed to find out." That sentence sliced through him like a blade. Never supposed to find out. Nicholas took a slow, measured breath, trying to suppress the storm of emotions surging inside him. "Why?" His voice was softer this time, raw with the weight of his question. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mara lifted her chin, her lips pressing together. "Because you didn't deserve to know." Nicholas reeled back as if she had physically struck him. "Excuse me?" Her expression was cold, but her voice trembled when she spoke again. "You made it very clear, Nicholas. The day we signed those divorce papers, you told me I was a mistake, that our marriage was a mistake. She let out a hollow laugh. I wasn't going to let my son grow up feeling like one too. Nicholas sucked in a sharp breath. He remembered that day. It had been brutal, ugly, a battlefield of accusations and regrets. He had been drowning in anger, in heartbreak, and he had said things, cruel, unforgivable things. But he had never imagined Mara had walked away from that day carrying not only the weight of their ruined marriage, but a child as well. Mara, he stepped closer, but she backed away, shaking her head. No, she snapped. You don't get to say my name like that. You don't get to stand here and pretend you're the victim. You moved on, Nicholas. You left and never looked back. His jaw clenched. I didn't move on, she scoffed. Oh, please. You were photographed with a different model every month after we divorced. Nicholas stiffened. She had been watching. Is that what you think? He asked quietly. Mara crossed her arms, her eyes hard with resentment. That's what I know. Nicholas exhaled sharply. You have no idea how much I hated my life after you left. Mara's lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her face. Do you really think I cared about any of those women? He shook his head. I was miserable, Mara. I drank. I worked myself to exhaustion. And yeah, I went on dates, but I never once cared about any of them. Her arms tightened around herself. Then why didn't you ever try to fix things? He swallowed hard. Because I thought you hated me. Mara laughed, but it wasn't full of humor. I did. I still do sometimes. Her voice cracked slightly. But it doesn't change the fact that you don't belong in Lucas's life. Nicholas felt something inside him snap. You don't get to decide that. His voice was low, but there was an unmistakable edge of authority. He's my son too. Mara shook her head. He doesn't know you, Nicholas. Then let me fix that. No. Nicholas stepped forward. Mara, please. Her eyes darkened. I said no. A tense silence stretched between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, years of unresolved emotions crashing into each other. Then suddenly, a voice called out, Mom! Both of them turned. Lucas stood a few feet away, frowning. Nicholas felt his stomach drop. Had he heard everything? Mara immediately softened, her entire posture shifting as she turned to her son. Hey, sweetheart, go back to the car, okay? I'll be right there. Lucas's frown deepened. Who is he? Mara tensed. Lucas, not now. But the boy ignored her, his sharp green eyes flickered between them, then landed on Nicholas. Why were you talking about me? Nicholas's heart pounded. Mara looked panicked. She wasn't ready for this, neither was he, but Lucas was waiting for an answer. Nicholas crouched down to his level, keeping his movements slow and careful. Hey, buddy, he said softly. Lucas studied him warily. Who are you? Nicholas swallowed the lump in his throat. My name is Nicholas. He hesitated, his pulse racing. And I'm your dad. Lucas's eyes widened. Mara inhaled sharply. A heavy silence settled over them. Lucas blinked. That's not true, he said automatically. I don't have a dad. Nicholas's chest tightened. Mara looked away, biting her lip. Lucas tilted his head, confused. Mom? Mara's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. She took a shaky breath and crouched beside her son. I was going to tell you when you were older, she whispered. Lucas's expression shifted from confusion to something else. Betrayal. You lied to me? His voice wavered. Mara reached for him, but Lucas took a step back. Sweetheart. Lucas turned to Nicholas, his little face scrunched in frustration. If you're my dad, why weren't you here? Nicholas's heart shattered. He exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. Because I didn't know about you, Lucas. His voice was thick with emotion. If I had, I would have been here. Lucas didn't say anything. His small hands tightened into fists, his face unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and ran toward the car. Mara let out a shaky breath, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Nicholas forced himself to stay calm. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Do you see now? She whispered. You showing up like this? It's not fair to him. Nicholas's voice was hoarse. I didn't mean to hurt him. But you did. Nicholas clenched his jaw. So what do you expect me to do? Just walk away? Mara closed her eyes briefly. I expect you to let me handle this. I will tell him everything, but on my own time. You don't get to force yourself into his life just because you feel guilty. Nicholas exhaled heavily. Every instinct in his body screamed to fight, to demand his right to be in his son's life. But deep down he knew Mara was right. Lucas wasn't ready, and forcing his way in would only push him further away. So, as painful as it was, Nicholas nodded. Okay. Mara blinked, clearly surprised by his sudden agreement. But I'm not going away, he added firmly. I'll give you time, but I want to be in his life, Mara. I'm not letting another 10 years go by. Mara hesitated, then gave him a small, reluctant nod. Nicholas watched as she walked to the car, sliding into the driver's seat. Lucas sat in the back, his face turned away. Nicholas's chest ached. This wasn't over, it was just the beginning. Nicholas watched as Mara's car disappeared down the street, his heart heavy with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had spent a decade believing his past was buried, that the wounds of his failed marriage had long since healed. But standing in that school parking lot, with the image of his son's confused and betrayed expression burned into his mind, Nicholas realized something painful. He had been fooling himself. Lucas wasn't just a boy in a photograph anymore. He was real, his son. And now the weight of 10 lost years crushed him. Nicholas took a deep breath and ran a hand down his face. He needed a plan. He needed to earn back what he never had in the first place. But where did he even begin? Later that evening, Nicholas sat in his penthouse office, staring out at the sprawling city skyline. A glass of untouched whiskey sat on his desk, the amber liquid catching the dim light. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city below. A decade ago, he had poured everything into building his empire, convincing himself that success would erase the pain of his failed marriage. He had become one of the wealthiest men in the country, respected and feared in the business world, and yet for all his power, he had never felt more helpless than he did now. A hesitant knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice gruffer than usual. His assistant, Daniel, stepped inside, carrying a stack of files. "Sir, these are the reports you requested for the quarter." Nicholas barely glanced at them. "Put them on the desk." Daniel hesitated. "You seem distracted." Nicholas exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Daniel had worked with him for years, long enough to know when something was wrong. "Is it about the woman and the boy?" Daniel asked carefully. Nicholas stiffened. "How do you know about that?" "I was there at the school, sir." I saw. Daniel hesitated. "I also saw how you looked at the boy. He's your son, isn't he?" Nicholas leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "Yeah, he is." Daniel nodded slowly. "What are you going to do?" Nicholas stared at the city lights. "I don't know yet." Daniel set the files down and gave him a knowing look. "You've built an empire from nothing, sir. You've won battles no one thought you could. But this is the most important fight of your life." Nicholas didn't respond, because deep down he knew Daniel was right. The following week, Nicholas waited. Mara had made it clear that Lucas needed time, so he stayed away, but not too far. He made sure his private investigator kept him updated on Lucas's well-being, not out of paranoia, but out of an unrelenting need to protect him. His son had gone 10 years without a father. He refused to let that continue. One evening, Nicholas found himself parked outside the modest 2-story home where Mara and Lucas lived. He wasn't there to barge in or demand anything. He just needed to see them, to remind himself why he couldn't give up. Through the living room window, he saw them. Mara was seated on the couch, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the television. Beside her, Lucas sat cross-legged, laughing at something on the screen. Nicholas's chest tightened. For years, he had imagined what his child would look like. He had assumed, hoped even, that his son would take after him. But looking at Lucas now, Nicholas saw Mara, the same sharp green eyes, the same dimple that appeared when he smiled. He had missed so much. Then something unexpected happened. Lucas suddenly turned toward the window, his small face scrunching in confusion. Nicholas froze. Did he see him? For a moment, father and son stared at each other, separated by a thin pane of glass. Then, before Nicholas could react, Lucas stood up. Mara turned to him, confused, saying something Nicholas couldn't hear, but Lucas ignored her and walked toward the door. Nicholas's heart pounded as the front door opened. Lucas stood there, small but stubborn, crossing his arms as he eyed Nicholas suspiciously. "You again," the boy said, his voice sharp with distrust. Nicholas cleared his throat. "Yeah, me again." Lucas glanced over his shoulder, making sure his mother wasn't watching, then stepped onto the porch. keeping a safe distance. Why are you here? Nicholas exhaled slowly, his voice careful. I wanted to see you. Lucas frowned. Why? Nicholas hesitated. Because I never got to. Lucas studied him for a long time. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, Are you rich? Nicholas blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? You were in a fancy car last time, Lucas pointed out. And Mom says rich people don't care about anything except money. Nicholas inhaled sharply. So that's what Mara had told him. He crouched down, leveling his gaze with Lucas's. Money doesn't mean anything if you don't have the right people to share it with. Lucas narrowed his eyes as if trying to decipher whether Nicholas was lying. Then, after a moment, he asked, Why didn't you come find me sooner? Nicholas's stomach twisted. I didn't know about you, he admitted honestly. Lucas tilted his head. Why not? Nicholas swallowed hard. Because your mom didn't tell me. Lucas's expression shifted, his small hands clenching into fists. She lied to me. Nicholas frowned. Lucas. Before he could say anything else, Mara appeared at the door, her face pale. Lucas, go inside, she said quickly. Lucas shook his head. No. He turned back to Nicholas, his voice firm. I want to know why you weren't there. Mara stepped forward, her eyes blazing. Lucas, inside, now. Lucas let out a frustrated sigh, but obeyed, walking back into the house. Mara turned on Nicholas, her expression furious. What the hell do you think you're doing? Nicholas straightened. He came to me. That's not the point. She crossed her arms. I told you to wait. Nicholas exhaled sharply. Mara, he was bound to find out sooner or later. She flinched as if the reality of the situation had just hit her. I get it, Nicholas continued. You were protecting him, but keeping me in the dark? That wasn't fair. To either of us. Mara looked away, her jaw tight. Nicholas softened. I want to be in his life. Mara closed her eyes briefly, then let out a shaky breath. Then prove it. Nicholas stiffened. What? Mara looked up, her gaze unwavering. Lucas doesn't trust you. And honestly, I don't either. So if you really want to be in his life, prove to me that you deserve to be. Nicholas swallowed the lump in his throat. Whatever it takes, he vowed. Mara gave him a long, hard look before finally nodding. Then we'll see. With that, she stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. Nicholas stood on the porch, his heart pounding. This wasn't going to be easy. But for his son, he would fight, no matter what. Nicholas stared at the closed door, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He had faced ruthless business competitors, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and survived scandals that could have ruined lesser men. But this, earning the trust of his son and the woman he once loved, felt like the biggest challenge of his life. Mara had given him a chance. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but an opportunity to prove himself, and he wasn't going to waste it. The next morning, Nicholas arrived at his office, but for the first time in years, he didn't dive straight into work. He picked up his phone and made a call. Mr. Nicholas, a deep, familiar voice answered. David, I need your help. David Sinclair was one of the best private investigators in the country. He had worked for Nicholas before, mostly on corporate matters, vetting investors, investigating fraud, and ensuring security. But today, Nicholas needed him for something more personal. I want to know everything about my son, Nicholas said. His favorite things, what he likes, what he doesn't, what he dreams about. David was silent for a moment before responding. Are you sure about this, sir? Nicholas exhaled. I'm sure, just keep it discreet. David didn't ask any more questions. I'll get you a full report within the day. Nicholas hung up, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't trying to invade Lucas's privacy. He just wanted to understand him. He had missed 10 years, 10 birthdays, 10 Christmases. He didn't even know what his son's favorite color was. That had to change. Meanwhile, at Mara's home, Lucas sat at the breakfast table, angrily stabbing at his cereal with his spoon. Lucas, Mara sighed, sipping her coffee. What's wrong? Lucas scowled. Why didn't you tell me about him? Mara set her mug down, her stomach twisting. She had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Because I wanted to protect you, she said carefully. I didn't know if he would want to be in your life, and I didn't want you to get hurt. Lucas's frown deepened. But he does want to be in my life. Mara rubbed her temple. I don't know if that's true yet. People say a lot of things, but actions matter more. Lucas folded his arms. I want to see him. Mara's breath hitched. Lucas, you said I could make my own choices. he interrupted. Well, I'm choosing to see him. Mara stared at him, her heart aching. He had her stubbornness, that was for sure. After a long pause, she let out a sigh. Fine, but we do it on my terms. Lucas's expression lit up. Really? Mara gave him a serious look. One meeting. That's it. If I don't like what I see, it's over. Lucas grinned. Deal. Mara's stomach churned. She had a bad feeling about this. Later that evening, Nicholas received an unexpected text. Mara, tomorrow, 4 p.m. The park near Lucas's school. Nicholas's heart skipped a beat. This was it. He had less than 24 hours to make a good impression. The next day, Nicholas arrived at the park early. Dressed in casual clothes, no suit, no tie. He felt strangely out of place. He was used to corporate settings, commanding boardrooms and giving orders. But now, standing in a children's park, he felt nervous. Would Lucas even speak to him? Would Mara change her mind? Then he saw them. Mara walked alongside Lucas, who was wearing a backpack and holding a soccer ball. His heart clenched at the sight of his son, his child, who had no idea how much Nicholas wanted to make up for lost time. Lucas spotted him first, slowing his steps. His expression was unreadable. Nicholas took a deep breath and smiled. Hey, Lucas. Lucas nodded, eyes darting between him and Mara. Hey. Mara crossed her arms. You have 1 hour. Nicholas appreciated her directness. I'll take what I can get, he said with a small smile. Lucas dropped the soccer ball at his feet. You play? Nicholas glanced down at the ball, then back at his son. He wasn't exactly an athlete, but if this was Lucas's way of testing him, he'd do it. Only one way to find out, Nicholas said. Lucas smirked and took a few steps back. Okay, let's see what you got. Nicholas laughed, actually laughed, and kicked the ball. The next hour was unlike anything he had ever experienced. They played, they ran, they laughed. At first, Lucas kept his distance, testing Nicholas's patience, but as the minutes passed, he started to open up. Nicholas learned that Lucas loved soccer but hated math, that he wanted to be an astronaut one day, but also a chef, that he collected comic books, had a dog named Max, and loved his mom more than anything in the world. It was the most time Nicholas had ever spent with his son, and he cherished every second. By the time Mara called for them to leave, Lucas was breathless and grinning. That was fun, Lucas admitted. Nicholas smiled. Yeah, it was. Lucas hesitated, shifting on his feet. So, are we doing this again? Nicholas's heart soared. If you want to. Lucas nodded. Yeah, I do. Nicholas turned to Mara, waiting for her reaction. She sighed, rubbing her temple. We'll talk. That was all Nicholas needed. As Lucas and Mara walked away, Nicholas felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. Meanwhile, Mara sat in her bedroom later that night, staring at her phone. She had just received an email. From Nicholas Carter, subject, Thank you. Mara, I know I don't deserve your trust yet, but I wanted to thank you for today. That hour with Lucas meant everything to me. I won't push you, and I won't rush this, but I promise I'll prove to both of you that I'm here to stay. Nicholas. Mara exhaled, setting the phone down. For the first time since Nicholas had reappeared in her life, she didn't feel just anger. She felt something far more dangerous. Possibility. Nicholas couldn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every second of his meeting with Lucas. It had been better than he could have hoped for. Lucas had laughed, played, and even asked to see him again. But as much as that lifted his heart, there was one more battle ahead. Mara. She hadn't pushed him away entirely, but Nicholas could see it in her eyes. The hesitation, the guarded walls. She didn't trust him, and she had every reason not to. Nicholas sat up, rubbing his hands over his face. He had spent years making decisions that affected thousands of people, but this was the first time he truly understood the weight of his choices. Lucas wasn't just some boy. He was his son, and Nicholas would do anything to be part of his life. The next morning, Mara was already deep in thought. She sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. Last night's email from Nicholas lingered in her mind. He had been different. Not the arrogant businessman she had once loved and later resented. Not the cold, untouchable CEO who had walked away without looking back. Number this Nicholas was trying. But could she trust that? Mara sighed, closing her eyes. Mom. Lucas's voice snapped her from her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, still in his pajamas, his hair a mess from sleep. Yeah, sweetheart, she asked. Lucas hesitated. Are you mad? Mara blinked. Mad about what? Lucas shuffled his feet. That I want to see him again. Mara's heart clenched. She had never wanted to be the kind of mother who kept her child from his father, but Nicholas had abandoned them. How was she supposed to just forget that? Mara took a deep breath. Lucas, I'm not mad, but I do need to be sure your dad isn't going to disappear again. Lucas frowned. But he won't. Mara gave him a long look. How do you know that? Lucas hesitated. I don't, but I want to try. Mara exhaled. This was the part of parenthood no one prepared you for. The impossible choices. The what-ifs. If Nicholas let Lucas down again, it would crush him. But if she kept Lucas away from Nicholas forever, wouldn't that crush him too? After a long pause, she finally nodded. Okay. Lucas's eyes brightened. Okay? Mara ruffled his hair. One step at a time. That's all. Lucas grinned. Cool. Mara sighed as he walked off. One step at a time, she just prayed it wouldn't be a step in the wrong direction. That afternoon, Nicholas sat at his desk, reviewing the file David Sinclair had sent him. It wasn't just a report. It was everything about Lucas. His favorite food, mac and cheese. His least favorite, Brussels sprouts. Hobbies, soccer, reading, and space documentaries. Nicholas smiled as he flipped through the pages. Then something caught his eye. Lucas's school records. His grades were excellent. Top of his class in reading, above average in science. But then Nicholas noticed a note from one of the teachers. Lucas struggles in math, often gets frustrated and avoids asking for help. Nicholas leaned back, rubbing his chin. Math. That was something he could help with. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts and made a call. Dr. Patel? A smooth voice answered. Mr. Carter, it's been a while. Nicholas exhaled. I need a favor, not for me, for my son. Dr. Patel chuckled. Well, that's new. What kind of favor? Nicholas explained the situation. When he finished, Dr. Patel hummed. You don't waste time, do you? Nicholas smirked. Never have. Dr. Patel chuckled. I'll send over some books and practice sheets. But more importantly, sit down and work through it with him. Kids don't just need the tools. They need to know they're not alone in learning. Nicholas's smirk softened. Got it, thanks, Doc. Hanging up, he glanced at his watch. Lucas got out of school at 3:30. It was 3:15 now. Nicholas grabbed his keys and headed out. When Mara arrived at Lucas's school, she was shocked to see Nicholas already there. He stood near the gate, hands in his pockets, watching as the students began pouring out. Lucas spotted him immediately. His face lit up and he ran over. Hey, Dad! Nicholas's heart clenched at the word. Dad. He had missed so much. Hey, kiddo, Nicholas greeted. How was school? Lucas shrugged. Boring, I had a math test. Nicholas's eyes sharpened. How'd it go? Lucas groaned. Bad, I hate math. Nicholas chuckled. I used to hate math too. Lucas looked up, skeptical. You? But you're like rich. Nicholas smirked. Yeah, well, I had to learn it the hard way. But I know a trick that makes it easier. Lucas's curiosity piqued. Really? Nicholas nodded. I was thinking, maybe we could try it together, if you want. Lucas hesitated, then slowly nodded. Okay. Mara, who had been silently watching, finally spoke. You sure about this? Nicholas met her gaze. 100%. Mara searched his face, trying to find any cracks. But this wasn't an act. For the first time in years, she saw something in Nicholas she hadn't before. A man who wasn't just saying the right things. He was doing them. All right, Mara finally said, but I'm watching. Nicholas smirked. Wouldn't expect anything less. That evening, Nicholas sat at the kitchen table with Lucas, working through math problems. Lucas groaned. I don't get it. Nicholas chuckled. Okay, let's break it down. Imagine you have $10 and you spend $4. How much do you have left? Lucas frowned. $6. Exactly. Lucas blinked. Wait, that's subtraction. Nicholas nodded. See, it's not as bad as you think. Lucas grinned. This is kinda cool. Nicholas smirked. Told you. Mara leaned against the doorframe, watching them. Her heart twisted. Lucas was happy, genuinely happy, and Nicholas, he wasn't just pretending to be a dad. He was a dad. And for the first time since he had come back, Mara felt something she never thought she'd feel again. Hope. But just as things seemed to be getting better, a storm was brewing. Nicholas had spent the last few weeks proving himself. But not everyone was happy about his return, because in the shadows someone was watching. Someone who didn't want Nicholas to have a second chance, and they were about to strike. Nicholas had spent the last few weeks proving himself. He had gone from being a forgotten father to someone Lucas looked forward to seeing every day. He had mended his relationship with Mara, at least to a degree. She no longer saw him as a cold businessman, but as a man genuinely trying to make up for his past. But just when things were beginning to settle, the past had a way of creeping back in, and this time it wasn't just memories. It was a real threat. It started with a phone call. Nicholas was at his office wrapping up a deal when his secretary knocked. "Sir, there's a call for you." The caller wouldn't leave a name, but they said it was urgent. Nicholas frowned. He didn't take anonymous calls, but something about the way his secretary hesitated made him curious. "Put it through," he said, pressing the speaker button. The line clicked. A deep voice spoke. "You should have stayed gone, Carter." Nicholas's entire body tensed. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled. "Let's just say not everyone is happy that you're playing house again. I'm calling to give you a warning. Walk away while you still can." Nicholas's jaw clenched. "You think you can threaten me?" Another laugh. "Oh, this isn't a threat, it's a fact. Keep pretending to be a father, and I promise you'll regret it." Then the line went dead. Nicholas sat frozen for a second, then slowly reached for his phone. He called David Sinclair, his head of security. "David, I need you to trace a call, now." David didn't ask questions. "Send me the details." Nicholas ended the call and exhaled. He had enemies. He wasn't naive. But this wasn't business-related. This was personal. And whoever it was, they were watching. Mara noticed the change in Nicholas almost immediately. That evening when he arrived at her house to pick up Lucas for dinner, he was on edge. He smiled, laughed with Lucas, but his eyes were constantly scanning. Mara finally called him out on it. "All right, what's going on?" she asked, crossing her arms. Nicholas glanced at Lucas, who was tying his shoes. He sighed and stepped closer to Mara. "I got a call today. Someone's watching." Mara's stomach dropped. "What?" "I don't know who yet, but they don't want me around Lucas," Nicholas said. Mara's instincts kicked in. "We need to go to the police." Nicholas shook his head. "Not yet. If they know I'm taking this seriously, they might escalate." Mara's hands clenched into fists. "You expect me to just sit here and do nothing?" Nicholas's gaze softened. I expect you to trust me. I'll protect both of you." Mara wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes made her pause. He was serious, and for the first time in years, she realized, Nicholas Carter was scared. That night, after dropping Lucas off, Nicholas drove straight to Sinclair's office. David was already waiting, a folder in hand. "You're not going to like this," David said. Nicholas took the folder and flipped it open. Inside were background checks, phone records, and surveillance reports. The number that called him? A burner phone, untraceable. But David had found something else. A series of payments made to a private investigator. Someone had been digging into Nicholas's life for months, and the name on the transactions made Nicholas's blood run cold. Samuel Greaves, Mara's ex-fiancé. Nicholas slammed the folder shut. "You're telling me this guy's been tracking me?" David nodded. "And Mara and Lucas." Nicholas's chest burned with anger. Samuel Greaves. Mara had been engaged to him a few years after their divorce. Nicholas had never met the guy, but he had done his research. Samuel came from old money, had a spotless reputation, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. And now, Nicholas knew why. David's voice was grave. "He's obsessed, Nick. This isn't just jealousy. He genuinely believes he was supposed to be Lucas's father." Nicholas clenched his jaw. "Where is he now?" David hesitated. "You're not gonna like this either." Nicholas's grip tightened. "Where?" David exhaled. "He's back in town." Nicholas swore under his breath. "Then we need to make something clear." David smirked. "Already on it, but Nick, be careful. This guy plays dirty." Nicholas smiled grimly. "So do I." The next morning, Mara got the shock of her life. She was walking out of the grocery store when Samuel appeared. "Mara," he said, smiling. Mara's entire body went cold. "Samuel?" "It's been a while," he said smoothly, stepping closer. Mara took a step back. "What are you doing here?" Samuel sighed, feigning disappointment. "No hug?" "No. It's nice to see you." Mara's fingers tightened around her grocery bag. "I don't have time for this." She turned to leave, but Samuel grabbed her arm. Mara's breath hitched. "Let go." His grip tightened. I heard about Nicholas, about how he's suddenly playing father. You really think he's changed? Mara yanked her arm free. It's none of your business. Samuel's eyes darkened. Oh, but it is. I loved you, Mara. I was there when he wasn't. Mara shook her head. You never loved me. You wanted control. Samuel's jaw tensed. I could have given you and Lucas everything. Mara glared. Lucas is not your son. Samuel smirked. Not yet. Before Mara could react, Nicholas appeared. Samuel. Samuel turned, his smirk fading slightly. Nicholas Carter. The absentee father finally decides to show up. Nicholas's expression was deadly calm. Stay away from Mara. Stay away from Lucas. Samuel chuckled. Or what? Nicholas took a step forward. Or I will destroy you. Mara had never seen Nicholas like this. His voice was low, his stance relaxed, but there was an unmistakable threat in his eyes. Samuel smirked. You think I'm scared of you? Nicholas smiled coldly. But you should be. Samuel's eyes flickered with something unreadable before he finally stepped back. This isn't over. Nicholas watched him go. Mara exhaled. You didn't have to do that. Nicholas turned to her. Yes, I did. Mara studied him, something shifting in her heart. For the first time, she truly believed Nicholas wasn't going anywhere, and that scared her more than anything. But Samuel wasn't done. Because while Nicholas was playing defense, Samuel was preparing his next move. And this time, he wasn't just targeting Nicholas, he was going after Lucas. Nicholas had dealt with threats before. In business, competitors would try to sabotage him, rivals would spread false rumors, and investors would attempt to manipulate him. But this was different. This was personal. Samuel Greaves wasn't just some disgruntled ex. He was a man with connections, influence, and an unhealthy obsession with Mara and Lucas. And that made him dangerous. Nicholas had two priorities now. Protect his son and take Samuel down before he could do any real damage. But as he would soon find out, Samuel wasn't going to make it easy. The first sign of trouble came the next morning. Nicholas was having breakfast at his penthouse, sipping coffee while skimming the latest market reports, when his phone rang. It was David Sinclair. Nicholas answered immediately. Talk to me. We've got a problem, David said, his tone tense. Samuel Greaves just filed a custody petition. He's claiming Mara is an unfit mother and that Lucas would be better off with him. Nicholas's grip tightened on the phone. On what grounds? David sighed. Bullshit ones. He's accusing her of neglect, emotional instability, and, get this, alienating Lucas from a stable parental figure. Nicholas shot out of his chair. He's trying to take my son. David's silence was answer enough. Nicholas swore under his breath. Does Mara know? I just got off the phone with her, David said. She's panicking. Nicholas didn't hesitate. I'm going over there. When Nicholas arrived at Mara's house, she was pacing in the living room, gripping a piece of paper in her shaking hands. As soon as she saw him, her eyes flashed with anger. He's taking me to court, Nicholas. He's trying to steal my son. Nicholas stepped forward. Our son, he corrected, and he's not going to win. Mara let out a bitter laugh. You don't get it. He's rich, powerful, and well-connected. The judge could actually listen to him. Nicholas grabbed her hands, forcing her to look at him. So am I. Mara blinked. I have more power than he does, Mara. I have better lawyers, better resources, and more influence. Samuel isn't going to win this fight. Mara searched his face. Do you really believe that? Nicholas's gaze was unwavering. I don't believe it, I know it. Mara exhaled shakily. Then let's stop him. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal meetings, strategy sessions, and endless paperwork. Nicholas called in the best family lawyers money could buy, ensuring that every angle of their defense was airtight. Mara, meanwhile, spent hours preparing for the possibility of testifying in court. But what weighed on her the most was Lucas. He was still too young to understand the gravity of the situation, but he could sense something was wrong. One evening, he crawled into Mara's lap and whispered, Mom, are you and Dad mad at me? Mara's heart broke. She kissed the top of his head. Oh, sweetheart, no. We love you very much. Then why are you and Dad always talking in serious voices? Lucas asked, his small brow furrowing. Mara forced a smile. Because we're making sure nothing bad happens to you. Lucas stared at her for a long moment before nodding. Okay. He trusted her, and she would not let him down. The custody hearing was set for 2 weeks later. But before they could even reach the courtroom, Samuel made his next move. One morning, as Nicholas was heading to his car, his security team stopped him. "Sir," one of the guards said, holding out a manila envelope, "this was left on your doorstep." Nicholas took the envelope cautiously. Inside were photographs. Photographs of Mara, of Lucas, and of Nicholas meeting them at school, walking them home, sitting with them at the park. Every single one of them was time-stamped. Nicholas's blood ran cold. They were being watched. David arrived minutes later, his expression grim. "This is a warning. Samuel is letting you know he's one step ahead." Nicholas clenched his jaw. "Then let's change the game." David smirked, already working on it. The final straw came a week before the trial. Mara was picking Lucas up from school when a black car pulled up beside them. The window rolled down, revealing Samuel. Mara froze and Samuel smiled. "Hello, Mara." Mara immediately pulled Lucas closer. "Stay away from us." Samuel ignored her. Instead, he looked at Lucas. "Hello, buddy. Your mom ever tell you about me?" Lucas hid behind Mara's legs. Mara's heart pounded. "Samuel, if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." Samuel leaned forward, his eyes dark. "You should have married me, Mara. I could have given you the world." Mara didn't flinch. "And yet I'm happier without you." Samuel's face twisted with rage. "That's a mistake you'll regret." The car sped away. Mara wasted no time. She called Nicholas. "Samuel just approached me at Lucas's school." There was a pause, then Nicholas's voice came through, calm but deadly. "Enough is enough." That night, Nicholas set his plan into motion. If Samuel wanted a fight, Nicholas would give him one. But unlike Samuel, Nicholas didn't play fair. He met with David, the legal team, and a group of private investigators. By morning, Nicholas had everything he needed. Documents, bank statements, a hidden scandal from Samuel's past, a secret that would destroy him. And when the trial began, Nicholas made sure Samuel never saw it coming. The custody battle was brutal. Samuel's lawyers painted Mara as an unstable single mother who had kept Lucas from a stable father figure. But then Nicholas's team fired back. They exposed Samuel's shady financial dealings, his ties to illegal business ventures, and even a history of domestic abuse allegations that had been swept under the rug. When the evidence was presented, Samuel turned pale. The judge took one look at the documents and made a decision. Custody remained solely with Mara. And Samuel? He was banned from ever contacting Lucas again. It was over. When the judge slammed the gavel, Mara let out a shaky breath, tears spilling down her cheeks. Lucas was safe, and Nicholas had kept his promise. Later that evening, Mara and Nicholas sat together on the porch. Mara turned to him. "Why did you do all this?" Nicholas met her gaze. "Because I wasn't there when you needed me before, but I'm here now." Mara swallowed hard. "So, what happens next?" Nicholas exhaled. "That's up to you." Mara studied him for a long moment. Then slowly she reached for his hand, and Nicholas knew. This wasn't just about making up for lost time. This was the beginning of something new. Nicholas had thought that winning the custody battle would bring him a sense of satisfaction. It did, but it also left him with a deeper, more complicated realization. Mara and Lucas were safe. Samuel Greaves was out of their lives forever. But Nicholas didn't feel like his job was finished, because now he wanted more. More time with his son, more nights spent at Mara's side, more of the life he never got to have. But wanting it and having it were two different things. Mara was still cautious around him, and he didn't blame her. After all, he had left her once before. It started with small things. Nicholas made sure he was there for Lucas every single day. He picked him up from school. He helped him with his homework. He tucked him into bed with bedtime stories, something he never imagined himself doing before. Lucas adored it, and slowly so did Mara. At first, she kept her distance, watching him like she was waiting for him to mess up. But Nicholas didn't mess up. He showed up, again and again. One evening, as they were putting Lucas to bed, Mara lingered by the doorway. Lucas had fallen asleep with his arms wrapped around Nicholas's hand. Mara's voice was soft when she finally spoke. "He loves you." Nicholas looked up. "I love him too." Mara hesitated. "I can see that." For the first time in a long time, there was no anger in her voice. Only something else. Something that made Nicholas's heart pound harder than it should have. Something dangerous. They began spending more time together, at first just for Lucas. But then it wasn't just for him anymore. One night, after Lucas had gone to sleep, Mara and Nicholas found themselves sitting in the dimly lit kitchen, a bottle of wine between them. Mara took a slow sip from her glass. "I never thought we'd be here." Nicholas watched her, his gaze unwavering. "Neither did I." Mara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Why are you doing this, Nicholas?" Nicholas exhaled. "Doing what?" "This." Mara gestured between them. "Being here, staying, after all these years." Nicholas leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Because I should have never left in the first place." Mara's breath caught. She stared at him as if trying to find the lie, but there wasn't one. Nicholas meant every word. Mara swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can forgive you." Nicholas nodded. "I don't expect you to, but I'll keep proving myself until you do." Mara looked away. "I don't want to get hurt again." Nicholas reached out, gently taking her hand. "Then let me make sure you never are." Mara didn't pull away, but she didn't move closer either. For now, that was enough. The next few weeks passed in a blur of late-night conversations, stolen glances, and attention neither of them dared to acknowledge. Until one night it all came to a head. It was a rainy evening. Lucas was already asleep and Nicholas was about to leave, but then the power went out. Mara let out a curse as the house was plunged into darkness. "Relax," Nicholas said, reaching for his phone flashlight. "It's just the storm." Mara sighed. "The generator is in the basement, but I hate going down there alone." Nicholas smirked. "Lucky for you, I'm still here." Mara rolled her eyes. "Come on." They headed downstairs, their footsteps echoing in the dimly lit basement. Mara shivered slightly. Nicholas frowned. "Cold?" Mara shook her head. "Just memories." Nicholas waited. After a long moment, Mara sighed. "When I first moved in here, I was scared. Raising Lucas alone, being a single mother, it felt like the whole world was against me." Nicholas's chest tightened. "I used to sit down here during storms," Mara admitted, "because I didn't want Lucas to see me cry." Nicholas stilled. Mara let out a humorless laugh. "Pathetic, right?" "No." Nicholas's voice was rough. "Not at all." Mara looked up at him, and in the flickering light she looked so damn beautiful it hurt. Nicholas swallowed hard. This was dangerous, and this was reckless. But then Mara took a step closer. Nicholas felt his breath hitch. "Mara," he murmured. She didn't stop. And then she kissed him. Software, gentle, hesitant. Nicholas didn't move at first, because he was afraid. Afraid that if he kissed her back, he'd never be able to stop. But then she whispered his name, and Nicholas was lost. He kissed her back, pulling her close, pouring every regret, every apology, every ounce of love he never got to show her into that kiss. Mara trembled against him. Nicholas cupped her face, deepening the kiss, his entire world narrowing down to this moment. And for the first time in years, everything felt right, but just as quickly as it started, it ended. Mara pulled away, breathless, wide-eyed. Nicholas reached for her, but she took a step back. I can't do this," Mara whispered. Nicholas clenched his jaw. "Mara, no." She shook her head. "It's too much. Too fast." Nicholas swallowed the lump in his throat. "I understand." Mara's lips trembled. "I need time." Nicholas exhaled. "Then take all the time you need." Mara hesitated. "You're not leaving." Nicholas shook his head. "Never again." Mara stared at him for a long moment. Then finally, she nodded. Nicholas knew then that this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Nicholas had always believed that money could solve any problem. But this wasn't a problem. This was his life, and for once money meant nothing, because the only thing that mattered was Mara and Lucas. Days turned into weeks, and Mara kept her distance. She wasn't avoiding him completely, but she was careful. Every time their hands accidentally brushed, she pulled away. Every time their eyes met, she looked down first. Every time Lucas mentioned how nice it was to have them all together, she changed the subject. Nicholas understood. He had hurt her too deeply for her to simply forgive and forget. But he wasn't giving up. So he showed up. Every morning he helped Lucas get ready for school. Every night he was there to read bedtime stories. And every day in between he made sure Mara knew. He wasn't leaving this time. One evening, after putting Lucas to bed, Nicholas found Mara sitting alone in the backyard. She was curled up on the porch swing, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring up at the night sky. Nicholas hesitated before stepping forward. "Mind if I join you?" Mara glanced at him, then sighed. "Sure." Nicholas sat beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then softly, Mara said, "I used to do this a lot." Nicholas looked at her. "Do what?" "Sit outside, at night." She exhaled. "After you left, I'd come out here and just stare at the sky." Nicholas's chest tightened. Mara let out a quiet laugh. "I told myself I wasn't waiting for you to come back." Nicholas swallowed. "But you were." Mara's smile was sad. "Yeah." Nicholas clenched his fists. "Mara, don't." She shook her head. "I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty. I don't know. I guess I needed you to know." Nicholas looked away. "I was a coward." Mara tilted her head. "Yeah, you were." Nicholas let out a breathless chuckle. "That bad, huh?" Mara smirked. "Worse." A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Mara shifted closer. Not much, just enough. And for the first time in a long time, Nicholas let himself hope. The next day, Nicholas found Lucas sitting on the living room floor, scribbling furiously in a notebook. Nicholas knelt beside him. "What you working on, buddy?" Lucas grinned. "A list." Nicholas raised an eyebrow. "A list of what?" Lucas held up the paper. "Reasons why Mom should marry you again." Nicholas's heart stopped. He took the paper from Lucas, reading through the carefully written bullet points. "He tucks me in at night. He makes Mom smile when she thinks no one is looking. He makes pancakes better than anyone else. He says sorry a lot. I think he really means it. He loves us." Nicholas's hands shook and Lucas beamed. "I'm gonna show it to Mom tonight." Nicholas froze. Panic settled in. He wasn't ready. What if Mara wasn't ready either? What if she read this list and said no? What if... Nicholas. Nicholas turned and Mara was standing there. She had seen everything. Lucas grinned. "Look, Mom, I made a list." Mara's gaze flickered to Nicholas, her expression unreadable. Nicholas held his breath. Mara took the paper from Lucas, reading it silently. Then she laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a forced one, a real, genuine laugh. Nicholas let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Lucas clapped his hands. "Does that mean yes? Are you going to marry Dad again?" Mara stiffened. Her eyes met Nicholas's. And for the first time since he had come back, she didn't look afraid. She looked like she was ready. That evening, Mara came to him. Nicholas was sitting in the kitchen, lost in thought, when she placed a cup of coffee in front of him. Nicholas looked up. "Mara?" Mara sat down across from him. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she took his hand. Nicholas felt his throat tighten. "I don't know if I can forget everything, Nicholas," she said softly. Nicholas nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." Mara took a deep breath. "But I think I can forgive you." Nicholas's heart stopped. Mara squeezed his hand. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." She swallowed. "I want to believe that you're really here, that this isn't just another mistake." Nicholas's voice was hoarse. "It's not." Mara exhaled. "Then I think I'm ready." Nicholas's pulse thundered. "Ready for what?" Mara smiled. "To love you again." Nicholas couldn't breathe. Mara's eyes softened. "But don't make me regret it." Nicholas reached for her, his hands shaking. "I won't," he whispered. And this time he meant it. A month later, they stood in the same backyard under the same night sky. But this time they weren't alone. Lucas stood between them, grinning. Nicholas took Mara's hands. "I didn't do this right the first time," he admitted. "But I want to do it right now." Mara's breath hitched. Nicholas knelt. "Mara, will you marry me again?" Tears filled her eyes. Lucas bounced on his feet. "Say yes, Mom." Mara laughed through her tears. Then she nodded. "Yes." Nicholas slipped the ring onto her finger. Lucas cheered. And as Nicholas pulled Mara into his arms, he realized this was what love really looked like. Not grand gestures, not expensive gifts, just them together. And this time he would never let them go. The end. Did this story touch your heart? Leave a comment below and tell us your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming and emotional stories.